I was a child of the 80s, and as such, I watched cartoons on TV when they weren't playing 24/7, and we only had like maybe 3 or 4 television stations to choose from. And one of those shows that I watched, one of the cartoons, one of my favorites of all time, G.I. Joe. At the end of many, if not all, of the G.I. Joe episodes, if you've never watched them before, there's a PSA, a public service announcement, where some kids, young kids, are getting into trouble or something happens, and then one of the Joes comes along and basically says, "Hey, don't do that." And they're like, "Whoa, it's you, Joe character," whatever the character's name was, except Snake Eyes. Snake Eyes never really did it, because Snake Eyes didn't talk. But it'd be like, "Duke," or like Scarlet, or whatever. And then they would proceed, the Joe, the hero, would proceed to basically explain what was going on, why they had to watch out. And then the kids would respond, "And now we know." And then the Joe would respond, "And knowing is half the battle." And then it was G.I. Joe. Probably brought back a few memories. Certainly, it brings back memories. I can see them playing out in my mind. This is long before pork chop sandwiches. It's a completely different topic. Knowing is half the battle. And that's something that made sense, because it was a fun thing for them to say, but it didn't really click for me until much later on in life, when I quickly came to realize that we, as human beings, do not come with instruction manuals. There are a lot of books written about the human condition and various aspects to our lives, but we don't have a manual. Me and my life and my condition, my nature, my nurture state is going to be different from many others. I mean, there are similarities that we have, certainly, but as we develop differently, and sometimes we are impeded in our progress by certain shortcomings, perceived shortcomings that we have that we are not aware of. For example, let's say you have experienced a few hiccups, right? Where you were, I'm going to try to choose one example here, effectively not able to concentrate on something. And you couldn't concentrate on it, and this would happen over and over again, or you'd start a project, you couldn't finish it, and you experienced all of these symptoms, and you thought it was just you, right? And then you start doing some research, and like, well, maybe it's this condition, right? Maybe the symptoms that I'm having are indicative of this condition, like ADD or ADHD. And you look it up, and you're like, nah, I haven't been diagnosed, I'm good, right? I don't have that. But yet, you still experience everything indicative of that particular condition. But because you're not actually taking the step forward to verify, to find potential therapy, if that could potentially alleviate the problem or give you the mental tools that you need to better succeed with that condition, because there's no shame in that, or medication, again, no shame, but it could very well help you process and get through life that would otherwise not have been as fulfilling, because this type of condition could keep you from being your true self, can hold you back from being your true self. But once you admit it and recognize it for what it is, then and only then can you begin to accommodate it. So that is where it clicked for me. Now we know, and knowing is half the battle. Because if you ignore the problem, it's not going to go away. That's probably a topic I can dedicate an immense amount of time on. But if you ignore the problem and you pretend it doesn't exist, it doesn't necessarily cease to exist, and it doesn't necessarily impact every aspect of your life, whether you know it or not, because you're choosing not to know it at that point. Because if there's a question as to whether or not it is something, then the onus is on you to see it through. Because if you don't, nobody else will. It's nobody else's responsibility. It's your responsibility. You've got to get a hold of it. But to get a hold of it, you have to recognize it as something. And to recognize it as something, you have to see it for what it is. You go through the process by which you can be diagnosed with one condition or another, right? Some affliction that is hurting you. And it may not be a physical pain, but not every amount of hurt is physical pain. Some of it's mental anguish, especially if your life feels like it's hitting a wall. You're running into problems that's keeping you, or you feel are keeping you from living your life to the fullest. You have to know it. But to know it, first, you need to admit that it's there. You have to see it. You have to recognize it. You have to face it. Then you can begin to know it. You can understand it. You can accommodate it. And that's what it means. Knowing is half the battle. Because you're not even in it. You're battling with yourself up until then. And if you want to battle the condition, you have to recognize it, and then you have to know it. Then the true work begins. Because instead of fighting against yourself, you're fighting against the condition. You're battling against the condition. But it begins with that, knowing it. That's what it means. Too many people, far too many people ignore that. They ignore that about themselves. Oh, I don't have that. I'll be fine. I can deal with it. It's fine. But they don't realize the cumulative effect of all these conditions, for the lack of a better word, that it's a relatively neutral term, right? Things that we can't necessarily control, that are impacting their lives. And by continuing to punt, you're losing time. And remember what I said before, time is the most valuable thing you have. And you can either continue to waste it, or you can spend it becoming better. But to become better, you have to recognize what's wrong. You have to know. And then you can begin the war against the condition. Until then, you're fighting with yourself. And potentially with others around you. Certainly with others who see that condition. A crippling condition. Something that impedes your ability to thrive. Your ability to exist. Right? Keeps you down in one way, shape, or form. Not necessarily physically. Could very well and most likely is emotionally. That impacts everybody, not just you. You have to see it, know it, and then fight it. Because you can't fight something you don't know. You can't fight something you don't recognize. You're not going to begin to fight something you don't believe exists, even if it really does. That is why knowing is half the battle.